The sky above you is not dark, it is deep red, the colour of something that has not yet happened. You are standing on a plain of black rock, and the air is thin here, dry against your lips. Two shapes move at the edge of your vision, slow and circling, like moons that have learned to walk. You are not afraid. Not yet. The plain stretches in all directions. There is no wind, there is no sound, but the soft movement of those two figures, circling, always circling, patient as orbiting things. The rock beneath your feet is warm, as if something deep below it still holds the memory of heat. You cannot see their faces. You do not need to. This is where they began. Long before the plains of Troy, long before any shield was forged or any army stood in the grey morning waiting for a signal. They began here, in a moment older than the oldest war, born from a union that should have made something beautiful, and did in its way, though not in any way that could be held gently. Their names were spoken before they could speak them. That is how it is, sometimes, with gods. Two shapes, circling. You watch them. They do not look back. On the night Phobos and Deimos were born, Olympus was quiet. That was the strange thing. There was no thunder, no trembling of the mountain. Aphrodite lay still in the half-dark, and the light around her was the particular gold that always seemed to follow her, even when she was tired, even when she turned her face away from it. The room smelled of warm stone and something faintly sweet, the way air smells after lightning has passed through it and left nothing behind. Ares was nearby. He had not sat down. He stood near the doorway, and the doorway was not large enough for him, not really, though he made no move to enter fully or to leave. He had been in this position for some time. His armour was not on him. That was unusual. His hands were at his sides. Aphrodite did not look at him. She looked at what she held. Two infants, small even for divine children, and very still in that first moment, the way all new things are still before the world gets into them. Then the first one made a sound. It was not a cry. It was more like the intake of breath an army makes when it sees something on the horizon it is not prepared for. Brief, collective, complete. Ares moved then. He crossed the room. He stood over them and looked down, and something shifted in his expression, some rearrangement that was not quite tenderness and not quite recognition, but something between the two. He reached out a hand, and his hand was large and scarred across the knuckles, and he touched the side of the first child's face very gently. "Fear," he said. His voice was low. It was not the voice he used in battle. It was a different register entirely. He touched the second one. "Dread," he said. Aphrodite closed her eyes. Hesiod would later name them in the Theogony, setting them down among the ordered children of the gods with the same care he gave to all things, Phobos and Deimos. Born of Ares and golden Aphrodite, companions of their father, attendants upon the works of war, the Theogony does not linger on them. It does not describe Aphrodite's face or Ares's hands or the quiet in the room. It gives them names and moves on. That is how the Theogony works. The naming is the thing. But names are not small. To name a child, fear is to understand something about the world that most parents spend their lives refusing. Fear is real. It has shape. It has weight. It moves through armies like a river finding the lowest ground, and it cannot be stopped once it has begun to run, only survived, only witnessed, only named. Phobos was that, the rout, the breaking of ranks, the moment a line of soldiers, steady for hours, simply ceases to hold. Not because anyone gave an order, not because any wall fell or any general fell, because something moved through them that had no name until Ares gave it one. Deimos was different. Deimos was what came before, the dread that settles in the night before a battle, when the camp is too quiet and the fires are burned down and no one is sleeping, though everyone is lying still. Deimos was the cold in the hands at dawn. the way a man's breath shortens when he hears the distant sound of another army moving. Not yet close, not yet certain. Two faces of the same thing, two children of war and love, born in a room that smelled of sweet air and warm stone, lying still while their father named them and their mother kept her eyes closed. Aphrodite did not speak for a long while. When she did, she said nothing that the old poets recorded. What she said, if she said anything, belonged to that room and to that moment and to the strange particular silence of a mother holding two children who will grow into forces larger than any single story. She loved them. That much is not complicated. She was the goddess of love. Love was not for her an abstraction. It was specific and fierce, and without regard for whether the beloved thing was convenient to love. She had held Eros, bright and winged. She would hold Harmonia, her daughter, who would become something like peace, though peace is rarely simple. She held now two children whose names were Fear and Dread, and she held them the same way. Ares watched from the doorway again, back in his position, not quite entering, not quite leaving. Outside, Olympus turned slowly toward morning. The red of the sky, that deep particular red, began to soften at its edges, and the plain of black rock below caught the first pale light. Two shapes still circling, patient as something that has nowhere else to be. They would be there when the horses were harnessed. They would be there when the armies gathered on the plain of Troy. They would be there when shields were raised and when shields fell. They would attend their father through every descent and every departure, always close, always circling, their names worn into the hearts of soldiers who had never heard them spoken and yet knew them completely. But that was not yet. That was later. For now they were only new, only still. Only two small things lying in the golden light of their mother's room, with their father's hands nearby and their father's voice fading into silence. And the whole long story of what they would become waiting ahead of them like a plain that has not yet been crossed. The twins had not moved. Aphrodite's arms had not shifted, and the room still held its particular quiet. Warm stone and that faint sweetness that clung to the air after lightning passes. If these stories have become part of your nights, a quiet subscribe helps them reach others who need them too. The gold around her had not dimmed. Ares had returned to the doorway. He stood there the way stone stands, not choosing to be where it is, simply being there because it has always been there. His hands were at his sides. His knuckles caught the faint light. There were others in the house of Ares. This was not a place of solitude, though solitude was one of its qualities, the way a large room can feel empty even when it is occupied. There was movement in the corridor. Quiet movement, soft-footed, the kind made by those who understand that certain rooms require a particular kind of silence. Eros had come first to see them. He was small himself in those early days, or rather he appeared small, for gods are not fixed in size the way mortals are. He appeared that day as a young figure, bright-eyed, standing just past the doorway until Aphrodite turned her head and looked at him, and then he came forward without hesitation. He looked at the twins for a long time. He did not say what he thought, he only looked. Anteros came behind him, slightly slower, with the careful bearing of someone who weighs things before moving toward them. He stood beside Eros. Both of them looked down at Phobos and Deimos in their mother's arms, these two who had come into the world so still, so quiet, with names already waiting for them. The room had 4 of Aphrodite's children in it now, and the air was complicated with what that meant. Love and its counterpart. Fear and its companion, dread. A full range, if one thought about it that way, from the thing that draws people together to the things that drive them apart. Harmonia was not yet there. She would come later, moving through that same corridor with her own particular quality of stillness, which was different from Deimos's stillness, the way water in a pool is different from water in a stone. Harmonia's stillness was a resolution. The twins' stillness was a waiting, Aphrodite watched her older children with careful eyes. She had a way of tending to those around her that required no gesture, only attention. It was not a soft attention. It was precise. She noted what each child needed and gave it without announcement. Eros, she knew, needed to be close. She let him sit beside her on the low couch, near enough to look down at the infants. Antiros, she knew, needed to understand things before he moved. She met his gaze and held it, steady, until some question in him settled. Then she looked down at the twins again. Phobos and Deimos had opened their eyes. Not fully, not with the wide, indiscriminate look of ordinary newborns. They opened their eyes the way a scout parts tall grass, a careful fraction, taking in exactly as much as was needed. Their eyes were dark. Not the dark of shadow, but the dark of depth, the colour a plane turns just before dawn when light exists, but has not yet committed to any particular direction. Ares made a sound in the doorway. Not a word. A sound low in the chest, acknowledging something without naming it. Aphrodite did not look up. She was tracing with one finger the line of Phobos's jaw, very gently. The way she had done with Eros, the way she would do with Harmonia. There was no difference in how she touched them. Love for her did not calibrate itself to the nature of the beloved. The twins were still. They did not lean into her hand. They did not pull away. They received the touch with a quality of complete attention, as if they were already learning the world through its surfaces, cataloguing what was gentle and what was not. Outside the corridor, the house extended into a series of rooms, most of them half dark and cool. The house of Ares was not a place of elaborate decoration. There were weapons here, some hanging on the walls, some leaning in corners. There was a long table of black stone, worn smooth by use. There was a courtyard that no one entered casually, and at its centre, on a low platform of flat stone, a vessel that held water but never settled into stillness, always moving in very small circles, as though something beneath it breathed. This was the vessel the retinue used for checking the weather of war. Eris had shown it to Phobos and Deimos later, years later, in the slow divine sense of years, standing over it in the way she stood over everything, with an expression of mild amusement at what the world kept doing to itself. But that was later. Now they were new. Eros leaned down and looked at Deimos very closely, close enough that his breath touched the infant's face. Deimos blinked once, and Eros sat back with an expression that suggested he had confirmed something he had already suspected. Antiros had moved to look at Phobos. He did not lean as close. He looked from the distance of someone who understands that certain things ask to be considered from a step away. He was quiet for a long time, and then he turned and left the room, back down the corridor, and his footsteps faded until they were nothing. Aphrodite watched him go. Her gold did not waver. It moved with her breathing, slow and even, a light that was not separate from her but continuous with her. The way warmth is continuous with a fire rather than produced by it. The twins lay still in her arms. Outside, the sky above the black plain had softened further, the deep red becoming something paler and less certain at the horizon. The circling shapes below had slowed, moving with the particular patience of things that understand time differently than mortals do. Ares remained in the doorway a little longer. He looked at the room, at his children in their mother's arms, at the light that moved with Aphrodite's breath. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, and the sound of his steps was quiet for such a large figure. Careful in the way that only the most practiced fighters are careful, conserving everything, wasting nothing, already carrying somewhere within him the shape of every battle that was still ahead. The corridor was empty now. The sound of Ares' footsteps had finished, and the house settled back into its particular quiet, the quiet of stone that has absorbed many things and releases none of them. Aphrodite sat with the twins and did not move. The gold of her light shifted with each breath. Slow, easy, continuous. The room was warm. The twins were still. Outside, The pale line at the horizon had widened by a fraction. Not yet dawn, still the space before it, where the sky commits to nothing. She looked at Phobos first. He was watching the ceiling or the air, or something that had no name in the ceiling or the air. His attention had the quality of something already measuring distance, already assessing what was near and what was far and what might matter. He was, she understood, a few hours old. She looked at Deimos. His eyes had tracked back to her face. He was watching her with the same measuring attention, but his was different in direction, turned inward toward what was about to happen rather than outward toward what was already present. He was looking at her the way one looks at a door before it opens. She had not expected to love them immediately. She had not expected to love them the way she loved Eros, which was a love of recognition, or the way she would come to love Harmonia, which would be a love of relief. What she felt now was something else. More deliberate, a love that understood what it was choosing. She had known, carrying them, what they would be. Ares was not a god who produced children of neutral temperament, and she was not a goddess who softened what was difficult by looking away from it. She had looked at the nature of these children, and then she had looked at the children, and she had found no contradiction between loving them and knowing them. Phobos. Fear, the name Ares had given, standing in the doorway at the moment of their first breath, when he had looked at his sons and spoken as though confirming something the world had already decided. She had not argued with the names. Names! For gods were not labels, they were descriptions of what a thing already was. Phobos was fear because fear was already in him, organized and still, waiting to find a form. Deimos was dread because dread was the texture of what moved inside him. They had not been named into their natures. They had been recognized. She shifted slightly on the low couch. Deimos closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Phobos did not. There was a smell in the room still, faint now, the smell that follows lightning when the charge has dispersed, and what remains is something cleaner than air normally is. A scent of aftermath, of energy spent and gone. It had been present since the beginning of the night, and was only now fading. By morning it would be gone entirely. She thought about what it meant to be born of her. Eros had her capacity for reaching. Anteros had her capacity for enduring. Harmonia would carry her capacity for making things cohere. Each child had taken something from her, not everything, a particular strand, and woven it into what they were. Phobos and Deimos had taken the one she had not expected to give. She was, among all things, the goddess of what pulls toward, what draws one thing to another. The force that does not ask permission and does not apologize for its direction, and at the far end of that force she understood now, holding them, was its opposite. What drove apart? What created the space between things by making that space feel absolute? Fear was the distance between a person and what they could not face. Dread was the awareness of that distance before you even looked. Both of them lived in the place where desire met its limit. Both of them were, in their way, children of love. She had thought about this before. She was thinking about it again. The twins would not grow in the ordinary sense of growing. They would not become something different from what they were now. They would fill out what was already present, the way a river fills its banks, not changing course but deepening in place. What they were now, new and still, with their dark eyes and their quality of waiting, was already what they would be. She was holding not the beginning of their natures, but the natures themselves, compact and present, resting. She traced again the line of Phobos's jaw. He received the touch. He did not close his eyes. Deimos made a small sound, not distress, something less than sound. Almost a movement of air in the throat, as if adjusting to the room. She turned her hand and touched his cheek. The same touch, the same pressure. No difference in how she offered it. He was still. The courtyard beyond the corridor breathed in its way. the vessel on its low stone platform continuing its slow turning. She could not hear it from where she sat, but she knew it was moving. She could feel its rhythm through the floor, through the stone walls, through the bones of the house. That vessel had been there longer than the twins, longer than Eros. It had shown Ares many weathers. She wondered what it would show him when his sons were old enough to go with him. She did not pursue the thought. There would be time. There was always time in the long divine sense, more time than any individual moment required. For now, the room, the warmth, the faint sweetness of the air, dissipating slowly toward nothing. Phobos had closed his eyes. It happened without ceremony, without gradual stages. One moment his dark eyes were open, taking in the ceiling's distances. The next they were closed, and his face had settled into a stillness that was deeper than the stillness he had shown while awake. Not peace exactly, not the ease of Eros at rest. Something more like suspension, like a held breath that was not uncomfortable. Deimos followed a moment after. His eyes had been watching her face. Then they were not watching. Then he was still. She held them. The light moved with her breathing. Slow, even. Outside, the sky was paler still. The red had nearly left it. What remained was grey, and through the grey something beginning, not yet light, but the precondition of light, the state from which light would arrive. The twins slept in her arms, and she did not sleep. She sat with them in the grey before morning, and was present to each of them in the way she had always been present to those she tended, without announcement, without ceremony, just attention, steady, precise, undiminished. Her gold moved with her breath, and the room held still, and outside the plain lay open. And the shapes that had been circling were gone now, or had settled somewhere below the horizon's edge, and nothing moved across the flat dark ground. The grey did not deepen. It simply held, the way a pond holds still before a wind crosses it. Aphrodite remained where she was. Her hands were warm. The twins were warm. The room contained them all without pressure, without demand. She listened to their breathing. Phobos first, then Deimos, a small half-count behind, so that the two breaths made one slow rhythm between them. She had not noticed when this began. It had arranged itself while she was thinking of other things. The corridor outside was empty. She could feel the emptiness, the way she could feel the vessels turning in the courtyard, not heard, only present. Ares had gone. His absence had a different texture than the absence of others. Where he had been, the air did not settle quickly. It took time to become ordinary air again. It was becoming ordinary now. She looked at the ceiling. Low stone, smooth, the colour of old ash, no decoration. No carved god looked back at her. The room was plain in the way a working place is plain, shaped for use rather than for impression. This was where Ares rested between things, between one call and the next. She understood that. She had her own such rooms. Phobos lay against her left arm, Deimos her right. Both of them still, both drawing slow breath, both entirely present in the way that sleeping things are present, more anchored than awake, more fully in their one place. She thought about what they would be asked to do, not asked. What they would do. There was no asking with gods born to a function. Phobos would move through battlefields, and men would break before him. Not from seeing him, he was not always seen. From feeling what moved ahead of him, the cold that rose in the chest without warning, the legs that turned without the mind's permission, the sudden terrible knowledge that there was somewhere else to be. That was him, the scattering of armies, the rout. Deimos was different in his work. He arrived earlier. He was the sleepless hour before a battle, the dry mouth of a soldier who had not yet put on his armour. He was what a man felt standing outside a city gate at dawn, knowing what the day held, unable to unfeel it. He did not scatter. He saturated. He was already in the thing before the thing had begun. She understood both of them. She did not judge what they would do. She had not judged Eros for what love made men do, the irrational choices, the wars that began from want. She would not judge these two for what fear made men do, the irrational retreats, the surrenders, the moments of cowardice that were simply the body knowing it could not survive what the mind was demanding. She was the goddess of what drove forward. They were the gods of what drove back. This was not contradiction. It was proportion. The sky outside was changing. Still grey, but lighter at its far edge, where the grey became almost white without becoming anything else yet. The plain was still. No movement on it. The shapes that had circled through the earlier night were gone, and in their place was simply space, open and flat, the kind of ground that armies crossed. She looked again at Phobos. His face was composed. In sleep it had gone even further into itself, settling below expression into something that was only feature, forehead, brow, the closed line of his eyes. He looked small. He was small. He would not always be small, but he was now, held in the arc of her arm, his breath moving against her hand. They would harness horses one day. That was where they would go first when Ares called them to work. She could see it, not as vision, but as simple knowledge, the kind that came with being divine, the ability to hold what has not happened yet in the same space as what has. Phobos and Deimos, at their father's chariot, tightening straps, checking the fit of the yoke, their hands steady on the horses' necks. Dark horses. Difficult horses. The kind that would not stand still for most handlers, but would stand for them. They would do it without ceremony. That was what she knew of them already, just from holding them through this one night. They were not given to ceremony. They were given to presence, to being in a place and being what they were in it, without announcement. Ares would descend to the Trojan plain with them alongside. That was the shape of what would be. He would call upon them, and they would come, as attendants come, as those who know their role, come, without hesitation, without the need to be asked twice. Eros would be there, and Enyo, the full retinue. The whole company of war, moving through the air above the armies below. She did not see the blood of it. She did not look for it. That was not her domain. But she could feel the shape of what her sons would be in it. Phobos, moving ahead of the front line, Deimos moving just behind the horizon of action, already there in the camp before the battle. Already settled into the men's bones while they slept. They were thorough, her sons. Even now, in sleep, they were thorough. Neither of them had done what Eros did, which was reach. Neither of them had done what Harmonia would do, which was arrange. They had simply settled. They had become entirely what they were and rested inside it, compact and complete. The vessel turned in the courtyard. She felt it through the floor, through the stone walls, a slow turning, the same pace it had kept all night. Deimos made no sound. His breath was even. His face was toward her, tilted slightly, his cheek against the inner curve of her arm. She did not move. She held the position she had held for most of the dark hours. Her back was used to it now. Her arms had found their accommodation. The lighter grey at the sky's far edge was growing, not arriving. Growing, the way a sound grows in a room before it becomes distinct, accumulating presence before it could be named. The twins breathed. The vessel turned. She was the goddess of what pulls toward, and she sat with two sleeping gods of what drives apart, and held them with the same hands she used for everything. The grey outside continued its patient work. Somewhere far across the plain birds were beginning, their sound too distant to distinguish, only the fact of it reaching the room, thin and faint, a signal that morning was doing what morning does. Phobos slept against her arm. Deimos slept against the other. Neither of them moved. The birds were still too distant to name. Their sound came in layers, not distinct calls but a general accumulation, the way warmth accumulates before it can be felt as warmth. The room held it at a remove. Stone walls did that. They admitted what could not be kept out and filtered everything else into something barely there. Aphrodite noticed the sound without attending to it. Her attention was where it had been for hours, on the room, on the twins, on the slow turning of the vessel she could feel but not see. Phobos shifted, not much. A settling, the way a sleeping body sometimes adjusts its position without waking, finding a better fit within the space it already occupies. His head moved slightly against her arm. Then, stilled, she waited to see if more would follow. Nothing followed. He had found what he needed and stopped. The room was still again. She had spent the night knowing what the day would bring, holding that knowledge the way she held her son's. Without strain, without resistance, the day would bring the plane into use. Ares was already wherever Ares went before a battle. The full machinery of war had been set in motion by things older than this morning, older than this particular army. Older than the towers of Troy, visible through the gap in the stone if she had turned to look. She did not turn. What she held in her arms was not yet what they would become. That was the thing she kept returning to. These were her sons. They breathed at the pace of sleeping things. Their faces were still, but what they would do on that plane, the work they were born into, was already written into them the way grain is written into bread before the baking is done. Phobos would descend to the Trojan plain and move through it, not as a body moves, but as a cold moves, through skin and into the interior of a man before the man knows it has arrived. He would reach the front lines first. The soldiers would not see him. They would feel something happen in their legs, in the space behind the ribs, some animal signal that the body understood before the mind could name it. That was his work, not vision, not sound, presence converting itself into the need to run. There was no dishonor in it, Aphrodite thought. She had known men say afterward that they had felt it. That something had passed through the army like wind through grain, and when it passed, the formation had broken, men scattering toward the rear, shields left in the dust of the plain. They spoke of it with shame. But what they described was simply Phobos doing what he had been born to do. The shame belonged to the aftermath, the judgment of other men looking on. The feeling itself was clean. It was simply true. Deimos worked the other end. He was in the camp already, in the night before the battle, in the dry mouth of a man trying to sleep, in the stiffness that came from lying still for too long while the mind refused to settle. He was not a feeling that arrived. He was a feeling that had been there long enough to seem like the natural condition of the air. The soldiers lying on the Trojan plain this morning, those awake in the grey before sunrise. Pressing the heels of their hands against their eyes, listening to the sounds the camp made as it began its slow waking, they were already in the company of Deimos. They did not know his name for it. They would call it dread or sleeplessness, or the memory of other mornings like this one, but the feeling had a source. It had a god. He was here, in this room, his cheek tilted against Aphrodite's arm, his breath even. She could feel the opposing nature of it, what she was, what they were. She drew things together. She was the force that moved a man across a room toward another person, that made him say words he had not planned to say, that made the word yes come out of him before he had considered whether it was wise. She was the pull. Her sons were the other motion, the recoil, the hesitation. The moment when the foot, already lifted to step forward, came back down in the same place it had left. This was not a failure in them. She had thought about that for most of the night. A thing that drove back was not a lesser thing than a thing that drove forward. Without what drove back, there would be no tension. Without tension, there was no form. Even in what she governed, it was true. Love that met no resistance was not love. It was simple proximity. What made it love was the difficulty, the space between two people that had to be crossed. The uncertainty of whether crossing it would be welcomed. Her sons were that space. They were the thing that made the crossing necessary. The grey at the window had moved further into white. Still grey, but the quality of it had changed, the way sleep changes in the last hour before waking. When the body begins its quiet preparation without the mind's consent, the plain outside was still flat and still. No figures moved on it yet. It was the plain as it would appear before any of today's events began, before the armies dressed themselves in the full argument of war. The ground simply existed, patient and indifferent. Eris was already somewhere in the Greek camp. She did not sleep. She moved through the early morning the way rumours moved, finding the men already uncertain and leaning into them with one more thing to consider. Enya would come when the walls came down. That was her nature. She did not arrive early. She arrived at the point of final undoing, when the city was no longer defensible and the fire had already made the decision for everyone, and between those two, Phobos and Deimos. Between the first seed of discord and the last fall of a wall, there was the whole interior of war, and that was where her sons lived, not at the edges, in the middle. In the long stretch of hours when men had to decide whether to stand or go, and their bodies were giving them one answer while their commanders were giving them another. Deimos stirred, a small movement. He did not open his eyes. His breathing shifted, found a slightly different pace, then settled back into the rhythm it had been keeping. Phobos breathed, then Deimos, a half-count after. The vessel in the courtyard completed another slow turn. She felt it through the stone beneath her, that same smooth pulse it had maintained since before the deep of night. Before Ares had come and gone, before anything had happened in this room except the twins sleeping and the grey outside doing its incremental work, the birds were closer now. Still indistinct, still more presence than sound. But closer. Phobos did not move. His weight against her arm was settled and familiar now, as though it had always been there, as though her arm had grown to fit the particular pressure of him. His face was still composed. Still small, still entirely removed from what it would do when the sun finished rising. She did not wake them. The light at the window had a different quality now, not brighter. Not exactly, but the grey had thinned somewhere behind it, the way fabric thins at the elbows of a garment worn through many seasons. The darkness was still present. It simply had less authority than it had carried an hour before. Aphrodite felt the change without looking toward it. She was paying attention to the twins. To Phobos first, the particular stillness of him. He breathed, and then Deimos breathed, and the small interval between those two breaths had been the measure of the night. She had counted it without counting, the way the body marks time without being asked. Phobos would not stay still much longer, she understood that. Not because he was restless, he was not restless, he was simply aligned to something outside this room. The same way a compass needle is aligned without any effort or intention of its own. When the sun cleared the horizon, some part of him would feel it, and the stillness would change. He had been this way since before she could remember him being otherwise, even as a small child on Olympus. Before the wars had given him occasion to work, there had been something in him that attended to the space between things, between a raised hand and a lowered one, between a word and its consequence. He had sat quietly at the edges of divine gatherings and watched the intervals, not the actions, the pauses before them. She had thought it was a quality of his temperament then. Later she understood it was his nature itself. He was not a god who caused the flight. He was the god who lived in the moment when flight became the only answer the body could produce. That was an important distinction. She had turned it over through the long dark hours. Phobos did not move through a battlefield the way a wind moves, touching everything it passes. He arrived at a precise moment. The moment when a man's legs made the decision before his mind had finished arguing, when the shield dropped, when the formation opened, When the whole arrangement that commanders had drilled into their men simply ceased to hold, and what remained was the single animal fact of continuing to live. That was where Phobos was, not before, not after, exactly there. Deimos occupied a longer span. He was the full passage of the night before. He was already in a man before the man knew to name him. Present in the way that cold is present in stone walls, not placed there, not arriving from somewhere. Simply the condition of the material itself. The soldiers on the plain had carried Deimos down into their blankets with them when they lay down. He had been in the meal they barely finished. In the way they had cleaned and rechecked equipment that was already clean and already in order. In the conversations that had gone quiet in the middle and found no good way to resume. He was not dramatic about it. He was thorough. She had given them both something, she knew. Not intentionally. A mother does not design what she passes on. But she had been present at the beginning of them, and what she was had gone into what they were. She drew things forward. She was the appetite for approach, the willingness to close distance, and they had taken the inverse of that and made it their own. The hesitation, the step that does not complete itself, the space that does not close. Without that space, she thought, no crossing was meaningful. She had come back to this throughout the night. The crossing only meant something if crossing was difficult. If the space resisted, if there was reason to remain where one stood. Her sons were the reason. They were not opposed to her. They were what made her possible. The vessel turned in the courtyard. She felt it rise through the stone beneath her, that low, smooth rotation, steady as breath, steady as the interval between her son's breathing. It had been turning since before Ares came. It would continue turning after the sun was fully up, after the plain had filled with sound. Phobos breathed. Deimos breathed, a half-count after. The birds were closer now. She could not name them by their sound alone, not yet. They were still at the edge of audible, the suggestion of wings and small movement filtering through the stone. But they were nearer than they had been. The night was yielding something, slowly. She did not move to see. Troy's towers stood in the direction the window faced. She knew that without looking. She knew the shape of the city from long acquaintance. She knew which towers faced east and caught the first light, and which stood still in shadow until the morning was well advanced. She had no wish to confirm any of it this morning. There were men in those towers now, men who had stood watch through the night, rotating in the cold, looking out at the dark plain where the Greek camp breathed and occasionally flickered with low light. Those men carried Deimos the way the stone walls carried cold, not as a burden, simply as a condition. By midday, some of them would carry Phobos instead. Something would happen on the plain, and the carrying would change. Deimos shifted again. A small thing. His weight redistributed against her arm, and then settled. He did not wake. He was deep in whatever sleep a god of dread found, when the dread itself was dispersed across a city and a plain and a camp. When he was not called to concentrate it anywhere in particular, Phobos was still. His face was smooth in the thinning dark. His lashes rested on his cheekbones, unhurried. Whatever he would do when the sun came, he was not yet doing. He was simply here. Small and quiet and pressed against his mother's arm. There had been a time, she remembered, when the twins were newly named. Ares had given them their names at the moment of first breath. Not tenderly. Ares did not tend toward tenderness, but with a directness that carried its own form of care. He had looked at each of them and said what they were, and in the saying had made it permanent. Phobos. Deimos. Fear. Dread. Words that had existed before the twins, but that now had faces. Weights. Particular ways of breathing. She had held them then as now. Different room, different light, but the same weight of them, the same breath rhythm, the same sense that they were already oriented towards something outside the room that did not yet require them. The crossroads of that first night was long behind her. She had made no choice there. The twins had been born, and she had held them, and no other path had opened. This was simply what came next, and next after that, and here she was on the Trojan plain in the grey before dawn, holding the same two weights, listening to the same interval of breath. Phobos breathed, then Deimos. The birds moved closer. The vessel completed its turn. The vessel began its slow turn again. Or perhaps it had not stopped. She could not always tell where one rotation ended and the next began. The motion was that continuous, that undifferentiated. Like breath itself, like the interval she had been listening to all night. She thought about the shield. She did not know why it came to her now. With her son still sleeping, and the birds still finding their way toward the walls, perhaps because she had been thinking about faces. About what it meant that Phobos had one, that he was not only a force dispersed through armies and camps and the cold spaces between men, but a particular arrangement of features that a craftsman had once chosen to set at the centre of Agamemnon's shield. She had seen it described to her. She had not needed to see it herself. The craftsman had placed Phobos there deliberately, at the centre. Not at the edges where the battle scenes ran, men locked together, horses rearing, the grinding ordinary violence of the field, but at the centre where the shield-bearer's arm connected to the thing he carried, where the weight gathered. That was where the face went. It was described as terrible. A gaze that the craftsman had tried to render Gorgon-like, though Phobos was no Gorgon. He was something older than that classification. The Gorgon was a creature, Phobos was a condition. The craftsman had reached for the nearest available language and used it, because the nearest available language was the best any mortal hand could do. She looked down at him now. His face in the grey light was nothing like terrible. His lashes still rested on his cheekbones. His mouth was slightly open, a small, unremarkable mouth. The mouth of something that was resting. This was also Phobos. The craftsman had not been wrong exactly. He had captured something true. When Agamemnon raised a shield on the plain and men looked at that face, they felt what they were supposed to feel. The feeling was real. The face the craftsman chose had produced a real effect in real men. That was the god's power moving through the carved bronze. But the craftsman had only ever seen one angle. She had been thinking about this since before dawn. The shield face was not a lie, but it was a face made for an outward direction. Made to project, to strike across distance, to arrive in someone else's chest before the man bearing it had taken another step. The face on Agamemnon's shield moved forward. It was all forward movement. Nothing in it suggested the capacity to rest a cheek against a mother's arm and breathe at long intervals in the dark. Both were true. That was what mortals rarely understood about the things they tried to represent. They made an image, and the image was accurate in one direction. Then they thought they had captured the thing. Phobos shifted. Not much. His weight moved slightly, settled lower. She did not adjust her arm. She waited for him to find his own position, and he did, and then the breathing resumed. That same unhurried rhythm. Expanding, pausing, releasing. Deimos, a half-count after. The mortal version of Phobos wore a terrible face and looked outward from the centre of a shield. It had Gorgon eyes and some quality the craftsman had tried to render in bronze that suggested the end of ordered thought. That was real. She did not dispute it. But there was something the shield could not show, could not, by its nature, include. A shield faced outward. Everything behind the shield was invisible. What was behind the shield was this, the stone room, the thinning dark, the birds not yet fully arrived, the vessel turning its slow turn below, the god of fear with his cheek against her arm, breathing in the careful way that sleeping things breathe, taking nothing more than was needed. There had been a morning. years before this one, when she had watched the twins learning what their names meant. Not from her. She had not known how to explain it. From Ares, from the way battle worked when they went close enough to observe it, from the first time they moved through a camp and felt the men respond to them without knowing why. Phobos had come back from that first time with something changed in his bearing, not troubled, more settled, the way any being looked when it had touched its own purpose and found the contact clean. He had understood then that what he did was not cruelty, it was a force. Forces were not cruel, they were simply accurate. Deimos had understood more slowly. He was always the slower of the two in that way. Phobos arrived. Deimos accumulated. Deimos had taken longer to feel the shape of what he was, because what he was did not announce itself. It spread. It was already there before it was noticed. Understanding that kind of presence took longer than understanding the sharp kind. But he had come to it. She remembered the morning Deimos came to it. There was nothing external to mark it. He simply seemed, afterward, less uncertain about where to stand. She had not been present at those early battles. She was not a presence of that kind. But they had come back to her, both of them, and she had read what had changed in them the way she read all things, through proximity, through the quality of how they settled near her. She had held them then much as she held them now, different city. Different cold, different window facing a different dark plane. The same arms, the same weight distributed between them. The birds were fully audible now. She could hear individual calls threading through the general approach of sound. Some close, some still at a distance, calling to the nearer ones in short, plain notes. The grey in the room had shifted, barely. But it had shifted. Phobos would know it before she did. He was oriented toward the sun's position in a way she was not. He would feel the first real light at the horizon before it registered as light to her, before the colour of the stone changed in any observable way. He had always been that way. Even before the first battle, even before he knew what the sun's rising meant for what he was about to be asked to do, he had woken before dawn. Always at that same interval before the light, Deimos woke after. She did not think it was something they chose. It was simply how they were made. Phobos pointed toward arrival. Deimos inhabited duration. The cold in the walls had not changed. She felt it through her back where she leaned against the stone. That same low, even chill that had been there since before she sat down. The stone did not warm and it did not deepen. It was simply cold, and it held that cold without effort. She thought of Agamemnon lifting the shield. The terrible face at the centre clearing the way before him, men seeing it and feeling what it was designed to make them feel. Phobos moving through their chests before Agamemnon had taken the next step. The god in her arms breathed on. The birds settled into the rhythm of their calling, steady, overlapping, nearer than before. The vessel turned. There had been another shield. That was what she returned to now, as the grey continued its slow shift toward something paler. Heracles had carried one. Not Agamemnon's, a different shield, made by Hephaestus himself, hammered out in the divine forge with all the precision that God brought to metal when he was working at the full reach of his skill. She had heard of it. Every god had heard of it eventually. The thing was famous before Heracles had lifted it once in battle. Phobos was on that shield too. The craftsman had placed him there among scenes of killing, of horses rearing over fallen men, of cities losing their shape under pressure from armies. All of that rendered in bronze and inlaid work, and at the centre, again, the face. That same configuration of features that said, stop, stop thinking. Stop standing. She considered what it meant that Phobos appeared on two shields. Not one hero's weapon, two. One held by the greatest Greek commander on the plain of Troy. one held by the hero who had cleaned the world of its most terrible things, the man whose name mortals still said when they needed to invoke the idea of a strength that did not fail. Different men, different purposes, the same face borrowed for both. Phobos, asleep against her, did not know he was famous in that way, or if he knew, it was not something that moved him. She had never seen him pleased by the bronze renderings. He did not seek them out. He did not speak of them. They were made by men who had felt what he was and tried to preserve it in a form they could carry. That was a mortal habit, feeling something large and then immediately trying to give it a fixed shape that would hold still. The bird calls were constant now. The sound moved through the window in uneven pulses. Close, and then closer. One particular call, short and repeated, had been working nearer for some time. She could track it now without trying. Deimos had not moved since Phobos settled. His head was heavy against her other arm. He breathed in the slower pattern, the one that did not correspond to any external signal she could identify. Phobos breathed in rhythm with something below, the vessel perhaps, or his own interior measure. Deimos simply breathed when he needed to. No pattern she had ever mapped, just breath arriving when it was required. She thought about the shield of Heracles a little longer. The craftsman who made it had put Phobos among terrible things, but not as the worst of them. There were Gorgons on that shield. There was strife, Eris herself, rendered in iron on the rim. There were the fates moving through fallen bodies. Phobos was placed among these figures, but he was not identical to them. He held a different position. The Gorgons killed. Eris started wars. The fates closed lives. Phobos did none of those things. He only made men feel what they would feel anyway, eventually, when the thing they feared arrived. He moved it earlier. He moved it into the chest before the cause had yet become visible. That was his function, not destruction. Anticipation of destruction, which was a different thing entirely. Mortals sometimes confused the two. She had watched them do it. They looked at the shield and saw the face and assumed the face was the danger. The face was not the danger. The face was the signal that danger was near. Removing the signal did not remove the danger, but the distinction was difficult to hold when the signal itself looked the way it looked. The light in the room had changed by a measure she could now be certain about. The grey of the stone wall opposite the window was closer to the colour of morning than the colour of night. Not fully either, somewhere in the crossing. Phobos still had not woken. He was close to it. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. The deep sleep had a different texture from the near sleep. This was the near sleep. His body had already begun the work of orienting, drawing itself back toward the surface without any visible movement. She felt it through her arm, through the slight change in how his weight rested, more deliberate than before. Less abandoned. Deimos was still genuinely under. She did not disturb either of them. There was nothing that required her to move. The room could hold all three of them for a while longer. The cold in the walls was the same cold. The birds were simply more of them now, the calls layering over each other until the sound was nearly continuous, broken only by small gaps through which silence briefly showed. She thought of Heracles carrying the shield through whatever morning had preceded whatever battle, the image of her son on his arm. Moving forward with that face projecting outward, clearing the way, men seeing it and understanding without words that what came after the shield would not be stoppable. Phobos doing the work from a distance, already inside the men opposing Heracles before Heracles had arrived. Two shields, two great heroes. The same function. The face travelling forward across time from one warrior to the next, attached to no single army, owing allegiance to no particular cause. Phobos was not a Greek force or a Trojan one. He was available. He had appeared on Agamemnon's shield and on Heracles' shield, and those were not the same war, not even the same era of the world's long unfolding. He went where the craftsman placed him. He did the work regardless. She looked at the sleeping face against her arm. The features in rest, eyes closed, mouth soft, the light still too dim to make out much beyond the shape of his head, the angle of his cheek. Nothing in it that suggested the bronze face. Both were the same being. She knew that. It was simply that sleeping required a different configuration, a different arrangement of the same material. When you slept, you gave up the outward-facing position. You turned inward toward whatever the sleeping self attended to. The face on the shield could never sleep. It was permanently directed outward, frozen in its purpose. But her son was not frozen. He moved through states. He had been awake and would be again. He had this brief crossing from one to the other, and in it he was only this: weight, warmth, breath. The vessel below turned through its rotation. She heard it or felt it. She could not have said which. It had been turning so long that it had become part of the room's silence rather than a disruption of it. The nearest bird called again. Closer than before, just outside the window now, or nearly. Deimos exhaled, long, unhurried, the sound of it carried in the still air. Phobos did not yet stir. The light continued its slow arrival. Her thoughts moved from the shields. She had held them long enough, those two bronze faces, those two great heroes. The image released itself, and something else came forward. Eris. She did not arrive with warmth. She never did. But in the thought she was only a figure, contained, manageable, the way most things were manageable at this hour. The goddess of strife rendered in iron on the rim of Heracles' shield. That detail had stayed with her, not at the centre. Not where Phobos was. Eris belonged to the rim, the outermost edge, the place where war began rather than where it was felt. That was the distinction that mattered. Eris threw the apple. That was her work. One golden object, one whispered word, and the whole architecture of consequence came down. Paris chose. Ships launched. 10 years of smoke and grief. Eris did not carry a weapon. She carried the beginning of the need for one, and Enyo walked behind. She was the aftermath given a name. Cities falling, walls opening, the work of destruction completed after everything else had agreed to it. She wore the ruin the way other gods wore armor. Phobos and Deimos moved in the middle of all that, between the thrown apple and the fallen wall. That was their territory, the interior space of conflict, not cause, not consequence. Sensation. The body's knowledge that something had already been set in motion. She looked at the window. The grey was more settled now. Still not morning, still not night. Among the retinue of Ares, the twins occupied a particular place, not first and not last. Eris moved ahead of armies. Enyo followed behind to finish what remained. But Phobos and Deimos moved through the thing itself. They were present when men were still standing, when the lines had not yet broken, when the hands were steady but the chest was not. That was what mortals misread. They thought the fear arrived because the danger had. They thought Phobos found them at the moment of the spear. He did not. He found them earlier, in the dark before the assault, in the quiet before the trumpet. He moved through the camp while men still slept, and by the time they woke the feeling was already there, indistinguishable from their own bodies. Deimos was different in this, more patient, if patience was even the right word for a god. Deimos was the long shadow, the dread that had no specific object. A soldier could name what Phobos brought him. He could say, "I fear the formation on the eastern flank. I fear the archer I cannot see." But Deimos offered nothing that specific, just the weight. Just the low presence that coloured everything without attaching to any single thing. Between them they covered the whole interior of war. Phobos named, Deimos unnamed. Fear and dread working through the same space from opposite directions, meeting in the middle where men made their decisions about whether to hold or run. Phobos shifted. Very slight, only the smallest adjustment of his weight against her arm. Still not waking, but closer, the near sleep doing its quiet work of return. She did not move in response. She let the adjustment settle. Outside, the birds had grown into a continuous sound. Individual calls still came through, but they were woven now into something larger. The window held the sound, the way stone holds cold. She thought of Ares, their father. The way he spoke their names when they rode out with him, not with tenderness exactly, but with acknowledgement. Something in the voice that named them as his. Phobos on one side of the chariot, Deimos on the other. Eris somewhere ahead, already doing her work. Enyo somewhere behind, already planning hers. And Ares between them all, the centre point, the source from which the whole retinue extended outward. The twins had not chosen their position any more than she had chosen to be their mother. The positions were given. That was how it worked with gods born into function. The function preceded the god. The name came with it. Phobos did not decide to be Fear. He was named Fear by the god of war at the moment of his first breath, and the naming was not separate from the nature. It was the same thing. She had thought about this at other hours. Not only this hour. There was a crossroads in it somewhere. The point at which something became fixed. Before the name was spoken, the child existed without definition. After it, the definition travelled with him wherever he went. Phobos could walk through a quiet meadow. He could sleep in a room on a vessel with cold stone walls and birds outside. He could exist in any state. But the name was always present, and the name contained the function, and the function was always ready. Deimos breathed. A different sound from the last one, shorter slightly. A change in register that she marked without interpreting. Phobos made no sound. The vessel continued its slow turning. She considered Enyo for a moment longer. Not with discomfort, simply with attention. Enyo destroyed cities. That was the plain fact of her. She was in Eris's retinue as Eris was, as the twins were, each holding a different portion of war's total nature. Destruction of the physical, strife of the political, fear of the interior, dread of the anticipated. War required all of them. None of them was war alone. Mortals sometimes try to separate these things, to say, we will have conflict without fear, we will have strife without ruin. The retinue could not be divided that way. They moved together. You did not get Eris without eventually getting Enyo. You did not get Ares without eventually getting the twins. The only variable was time. How long between the thrown apple and the fallen wall? How long the interior space lasted? How many nights like this one, with the fear already present and the cause not yet arrived? Phobos settled again. His breath came once audible. A single slow passage, in and out, then quiet. She heard it. She did not remark on it. There was nothing to remark. Outside, one bird called again. The same short call, the one she had been tracking. It was close enough now that the sound had texture. Not just a tone, but a small physical thing moving through the air of the window. The wall across from her was pale. Not yet white. Not yet lit, but pale in a way it had not been when the night was full. They were all still here. The three of them. The room still held. Deimos breathed again, his own way, arriving when it was required. No pattern she could predict. Phobos rested against her arm, close to the surface now, close to the crossing. She waited. There was nothing else to do. The light would finish its arrival. The birds would reach whatever conclusion birds reached. The vessel would continue its long, slow rotation in the space below her feet. And the retinue would ride again when riding was required. Eris ahead, Enyo behind, the twins between, moving through the interior of whatever came next. But not yet. The light was different now, not bright, not yet arriving in full, but different from an hour before, different from the deep grey that had held all night. Something in it had shifted, the way a stone shifts in a current, still in place, but no longer entirely still. Phobos breathed against her arm, long and low. A breath that came from somewhere deeper than the half-surface where he had been resting. She marked it. Nothing more. The thought that had been forming, the one about names and functions and the point at which things become fixed, it moved through her quietly and settled somewhere behind the eyes. Not gone. Just placed. There was an island. She had been thinking of it before the thought about names had interrupted, and now it returned. Icaria. A shore to the west, the kind of coast that came in low and long, dark rock and sparse grass and water that ran green in the shallows before dropping away. Not a grand place, not the white marble kind of place that drew pilgrims in procession with garlands and oil. Just an island, just a shore, and on it a sanctuary, sacred to Phobos. That was the thing she returned to now, that mortals had done that. Had taken the thing they feared most, the feeling that moved through soldiers like cold through stone, and had given it a house, a permanent address, a place where it could be honoured rather than driven out. She did not know which mortal first made that choice. The records of such things did not always survive, but someone had decided at some point that fear was worth acknowledging, that it deserved a threshold, a place of offerings. It was a turning of something, a change in how a thing was held. Phobos on the arm of his sleeping mother was one thing, Phobos on the shield of Agamemnon was another. Both were the same name, both were the same nature. But the sanctuary was different from both. The sanctuary said, "We have looked at you. We have not looked away. We have built you a room." Outside, the bird called again. The short one, the one she had been tracking across the whole of the dark hours. It was very close now. She turned her attention to the sound without moving toward it. The call had a beginning and an end. She could pass now, a small shape in the air, not just texture but structure. Two parts, a rise and a drop. The drop longer than the rise. Deimos shifted somewhere behind her. Not against her. He was farther. But she felt the shift in the room, the small redistribution of weight that meant his sleep was changing register. He breathed again. Shorter this time, coming faster. She did not interpret it. She waited. The thought about Icaria remained. What the mortals who built that sanctuary had understood was something she had taken a long time to learn herself. That you could not separate the thing from its function. You could not love Phobos and exclude what Phobos was. The function was not separate from the child. It was the same thing all the way through. But acknowledging the function was different from fleeing it. The sanctuary said, "Fear is here, and fear belongs here. And we will bring our grain and our smoke to this shore, and we will name it openly, and we will not pretend it is something other than what it is." That was the crossroads. That was the point she had been circling all night without quite reaching it directly. The crossroads was not whether to have fear. Fear came with the retinue. You did not choose it any more than the soldier chose to hear his own heartbeat. The crossroads was what you did at the moment you recognized it, whether you turned from it or turned toward it. Whether you named it, the way Ares had named his sons, or whether you let it remain unnamed and therefore uncontained, Deimos was the unnamed one. The dread that did not attach to specific objects. Soldiers who received Deimos could not say, "I fear the archer on the eastern flank." They could only say, "I cannot move." They could only say, "The air has changed." But even Deimos, unnamed in function, had been given a name. Dread. Not nothing, not a void. A word, a boundary. Somewhere a mortal had built a sentence around him too, had said, "This thing that moves through us without face or cause, we will call it Deimos. And it will have a twin, and together they will be wars interior, and we will know them." That act of naming was its own kind of sanctuary. Phobos was heavier on her arm now, the deep sleep pulling him further down. She could feel the full mass of him, settled and still. The wall was lighter. Not pale any more, beginning to resolve into white. One edge of the window held colour, not gold. Earlier than gold. The first grey-blue that came before the sky decided what it was. Deimos breathed again, long this time. The change complete, whatever register shift had moved through him now finished, both boys quiet. The vessel moved beneath them, its slow, unending rotation, the way the sea holds a thing without announcing it. She thought of the sanctuary on Icaria, the dark rock and the low grass and the smoke rising from an offering left at the threshold of a god who frightened people. The mortal who had stood there and set down the grain and said the name aloud without flinching. That mortal had understood something. That the thing you feared and the place you stood were not opposites. That you could stand in the presence of fear and not be unmade by it. That acknowledgement was a different action from surrender. It was the thing she had tried to give her sons in all the quiet hours. Not the absence of what they were. They could not be other than what they were. The naming had settled that before any choice was made. But the hours like this one, the vessel and the stone walls and the grey light arriving, the two of them breathing beside her. These hours were the sanctuary, not separate from their function. Not a hiding place, just a shore where the thing could rest. The bird called a final time, the two-part call. Rise and drop, then nothing. Either the bird had flown, or had gone quiet, or had found what it was looking for in the dark. The room held the silence. Phobos slept. Deimos slept. The light continued its patient work across the far wall. The light had reached the midpoint of the far wall now, not dawn. Not yet, but the grey-blue had deepened into something more certain. The colour of a sky that had made a decision about becoming morning without yet acting on it. She remained where she was. Phobos did not stir. His breath came in long, unhurried intervals, the breathing of someone very far from waking, someone who had travelled deep into sleep and would take his own time returning. His weight on her arm had not changed. It was the same settled pressure it had been for the last hour. Constant, a reliable thing. Deimos was still too. Whatever restlessness had moved through him earlier had resolved. The shorter breaths, the small redistribution of weight, those belonged to the darker part of the night. He was past them now. Both of them held inside the quiet. She let her attention move carefully, without urgency, toward the question she had not quite finished. Deimos, what he was before battle. What he was in the hour that preceded everything. She had spent years watching armies. Not as a soldier watched, from inside the formations, the shield rim at eye level, the smell of oiled leather and fear sweat rising from the man beside you. She watched from above, from outside, in the way that only a few beings could, and what she had seen in all those encampments. In all those hours before the trumpet was Deimos moving through the sleeping rows of men like a tide that did not announce itself. It did not arrive with sound. It was not like Phobos, who came at the breaking point, when the line gave way, when the sound rose and became a roar, and men began turning their backs. Phobos required a moment of fracture. Something to crack open the certainty of the group so that every man became alone. Deimos did not need fracture. He needed only the night before. A man would lie on his bedroll, wrapped in his cloak, staring at the underside of the tent canvas or at the stars between the tent poles, and he would feel it. Not the thought of the enemy, not a calculation of odds or a memory of past defeats. Something earlier than thought. the body's own knowledge that tomorrow the world would be different, that the crossing was close, that nothing which came after would be the same as what came before. Soldiers knew that feeling by name. They called it different things in different tongues, but the feeling itself was uniform across armies, across centuries, across every plain where men had gathered in large numbers to face other men. The air changed. The stomach settled into a cold stillness. Sleep thinned and became a surface thing, easily broken, barely shelter. That was Deimos, not the thing that caused flight, the thing that preceded it. The dread that had no object because its object was tomorrow itself. She understood why the mortals had struggled to name him. Phobos was easier. You could point to Phobos. You could say, there, in the moment when the left flank broke, when Hector pressed forward and the Greeks turned, that was Phobos, moving through them like wind through cut grain. You could locate the rout. You could trace it. You could put your finger on the place in the battle where fear became physical and organized movement collapsed. Deimos was harder to locate because he arrived before anything had happened. He lived in the subjunctive, the hour that had not yet passed, the outcome that was not yet known. He was the dread of the unresolved, and nothing stayed unresolved for long once battle began. This was why, she thought, mortals had sometimes struggled to honor him. They built sanctuaries to Phobos because Phobos was visible, traceable, an experience with a shape. Deimos remained more difficult. His presence was real. But the moment of his greatest power was also the moment least available to memory. Men who survived battles could recall the route. They could describe Phobos in detail. They rarely recalled the pre-dawn dread as clearly, because dread without outcome was a thing. The mind smoothed over afterward, filed away, declined to carry forward. But the body remembered it. Long after the battle, long after the outcome had been settled and named and turned into a story, the body remembered what it had felt in the dark before the trumpet. A specific coldness, a particular quality of sleeplessness. Not fear of a named thing, just dread. Just the open question of the crossing. Before the crossing was made, she had felt something like it herself, in ways she did not often acknowledge. The hours before Ares descended, the hours when she understood that the children beside her would be pulled toward their function as surely as a current pulls a boat. Not that she feared it. Understanding was not fear. But there was a register she recognized, a place in the chest where certainty was not yet available, where the outcome waited unresolved and the body simply sat with the not knowing. That was the crossroads Deimos inhabited permanently, the one-way path, visible but not yet walked. The crossing everyone could see and no one could avoid, and no one could predict in its particulars until they were standing on the other side of it. The grey-blue at the window had shifted again. Warmer now, almost. Not gold, but leaning in that direction. Phobos moved against her arm. Not waking. A small adjustment, the way a sleeper settles more deeply when the body is satisfied. He settled. His breath continued, long and even. Deimos made no sound. She listened to both of them. The different rhythms. Phobos, who arrived after the fracture, breathing now in the deep, unhurried way of someone who had no fracture to move through. Deimos, who lived in the hour before the trumpet, breathing in the quieter, more careful rhythm of someone accustomed to waiting. Even in sleep, she thought. They kept their natures. Even here, in the stone-walled room, in the pre-dawn quiet held by the vessel's slow rotation, they remained what they were. And that did not trouble her. It had taken her a long time, the whole of this night and many nights before it, to arrive at that simple observation without any additional weight attached to it. They remained what they were, and she remained beside them. The light finished its work on the far wall. The whole surface had resolved now, pale, even, unhurried. Not white the way midday was white, the white of a thing just becoming visible after long darkness. Both boys breathed. The room held them. The stone walls, The single window, the slow rotation beneath. Outside, where the bird had been, there was only quiet. Phobos shifted again, a small thing. His shoulder turned slightly inward toward her, and his breathing deepened another degree, settling past sleep into something below sleep, somewhere very still and very distant. She had not expected that, not the shift itself. She had felt him move against her arm through the long hours of this night, small adjustments, the body finding its way to comfort without the mind's involvement. She had expected that. What she had not expected was the quality of the stillness that followed, the way his weight, already considerable, already present, seemed to increase. Not in mass, in commitment. The way a sleeping thing commits to its rest when it has finally found the right position and has no intention of leaving it. She understood, without thinking it through, that he trusted her, not in the way that thinking beings decide to trust. Not a considered thing, not a choice made with the mind, the body's trust. The kind that only comes after something has held you through enough darkness that the holding becomes its own evidence. She had held him through this one. She thought about the other times, the hours after Ares had called them to the plain and they had gone, moving alongside their father like dark weather, and then returned. They always returned quieter than they left, Phobos especially. After the rout, after the broken ranks and the scattered shields, and the sound of men whose formation had dissolved into individual terror, after all of that, Phobos came back changed in a way she recognized without being able to name precisely, not regretful. That was not the right word, not troubled either. Something quieter than both of those, something like the stillness after a very loud sound. He would come back, and he would not say anything, and she would not ask. Deimos was different in that way too. He came back from the plain with what she could only describe as a particular precision, as though he had been careful the whole time, as though the dread he moved through armies was a thing he carried with great attention, placed deliberately, withdrawn completely when the hour passed. He had never once, in all the times she had watched him return, brought any of it back with him. She had wondered about that. What it cost, or whether it cost anything at all. Looking at him now, his face still, his breath thin and careful even in sleep, she thought it was neither expense nor ease. It was simply how he was made, the way a vessel holds water and then empties and holds again. The water is not changed by the holding, the vessel is not diminished by the emptying. Both of them go on, ready for the next occasion. That was Deimos. Always ready for the next occasion, never carrying the previous one. She could see both their faces from where she sat. Phobos turned toward her now, his features relaxed in the particular way that sleep does to faces that carry weight in waking hours. The heaviness gone. Whatever it was that gave his waking face its intensity, she had seen men flinch from that face, had seen even other gods glance away, all of it released. Set down somewhere outside this room, Deimos facing the window. The light had reached him too, not gold yet. Still the pale preliminary light, but warmer than it had been an hour ago. It touched the side of his face without drama. A quiet illumination. He did not look like a god of dread in this light. He looked like a boy who had been watching for something and had finally, in sleep, stopped watching. She had thought once that they would be strangers to each other. That fear and dread would not know how to be siblings. That one who moved through the aftermath and one who inhabited the before would have no common ground. Nothing to say across the distance between those two positions. She had been wrong about that. There was something between them she had seen many times and never fully described to herself, not warmth exactly. Not the easy closeness of Eros and his kind, who wore their feelings openly, something more like recognition. The way two people recognize the same sound from different rooms. They do not need to compare notes afterward. The sound was the sound. They both heard it. That is sufficient. Phobos and Deimos had heard the same sound from the beginning, They had been born into the same function, divided only in their timing, before and after, anticipation and result, and in that division they were perhaps more bound to each other than most siblings. Because neither of them could be understood without the other, you could not describe dread without saying what it dreaded. You could not describe the root without saying what had been dreaded before it came. They were a single arc, divided between two bodies. She sat with that thought for a while. The room held its quiet. The vessel's rotation continued, the slow and steady turning she had felt beneath her through the whole night, reliable as breathing. Phobos breathed. Deimos breathed. She did not move. Outside the window the colour had changed again. Not by much, a degree warmer. The pale of early morning beginning its slow work towards something more committed. The stone walls caught the light differently now, their texture more visible. The small irregularities in the surface readable where an hour ago they had been smoothed into darkness. A stone wall in darkness looks smooth, she had noticed. Every wall did. It was only when light came that the surface revealed itself as it actually was. Layered, complicated, marked by everything that had pressed against it. She thought about the twins in those terms without meaning to. What the light showed, Phobos in daylight. In the hours before a battle, was not the god she had held through this night. He was larger in some way she could not measure. Not physically, present in a way that pressed at the edges of whatever space he occupied. She had seen men standing 20 paces from him go pale without knowing why. She had seen horses shift their weight and press together without understanding what they moved away from. And yet here, in this stone room, in this particular quiet, he was simply her weight on her arm. Warm, slow breathing, committed to his rest. Both of those things were true. Both of them were him. She understood that now in a way she had only partially understood before this night. The god who moved through broken armies and the boy who slept against her arm were not different versions of the same being. They were the same being. Undivided. What battle required of him he gave. What this hour required of him he gave also. The same was true of Deimos on her other side. She looked at the window. The quality of the light outside was shifting toward the possible. Not dawn, not yet. But the hours before dawn, when dawn becomes credible, when the darkness begins to carry, faintly, the idea of its own ending. Both boys slept on. She had not slept herself. She was aware of that without distress. The night had not required it of her. What it had required was precisely what she had given: stillness, weight, the continued fact of her presence. These were not small things. She had learned that over many such nights. The sound of breathing, two rhythms, slightly offset. Phobos with the deeper pull, Deimos with the thinner, more careful one. She had tracked them without meaning to, the way you track the sound of water in a room where water runs somewhere unseen, not attending to it. Simply knowing it is there. Outside the window something shifted in the air. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of the particular silence that had held through the deepest hours. The darkness outside the frame had begun to separate from itself, black into dark grey into something else, something without a name in the early stages. She thought, Alexander. The thought came without urgency. She had been moving toward it for some time, in the slow, associative way that thoughts move in the hours before morning. Alexander, on the night before Gaugamela, had not slept either. She had not been there. She had heard it in the way that gods hear things, not through ears, not through messengers, but through the texture of what reaches across that distance. What she knew was this: the young king had knelt in the dark and made his offerings to the twins who slept beside her now. Smoke. Grain. The careful words of a man who understood that fear was not his enemy. Most men prayed to be delivered from fear. They asked the gods to take it from them, to leave them cold and certain as stone. Alexander had not prayed that way. What he had offered, what he had asked for, was different. He had asked to carry it well, to hold it without being held by it. To use the dread his body carried, the quickened pulse, the narrowed attention, the sudden clarity that comes when everything becomes consequential, to use all of that rather than be spent by it. She thought Deimos in particular would have received that prayer carefully, would have recognized it for the rare thing it was. Most mortals who felt Deimos working in them fought it, tried to press the feeling down, to reason it away, to sleep in spite of it and fail. Alexander had sat with it, had let it do what it was made to do. And by morning the dread had organized itself into readiness, had become, in his hands, something close to precision. Phobos, beside her, breezed on, unknowing, or perhaps not unknowing. Perhaps it was simply that sleep did not require the same acknowledgement. The light coming through the window had reached the far wall now. She could see it, the slow arrival on stone, the surface of the wall there, opposite the window, showing its marks. Small hollows, places where the rock had settled into itself over many years. A thin crack running upward from the floor, not new, not threatening, simply the record of time pressing on stone. Gaugamela had been won. She knew that too. The battle had begun in darkness and ended before midday, the Macedonian cavalry moving through the gap in the Persian line like something inevitable. Like something that had already been decided before the first horse moved. Whether Alexander's prayer had made the difference, she did not try to calculate. Prayers were not currency. They did not purchase outcomes. What they did was different, harder to name. They created a particular quality of attention. They made the one who prayed available to what was already present. Alexander had prayed to the twins, and by doing so had acknowledged what was true, that fear and dread were not aberrations in a man preparing for battle. They were information. They were, in their way, gifts. Phobos shifted. Not waking. Just the small adjustments of deep sleep, a shoulder rolling, a slight change in where his weight pressed against her arm. She did not move to accommodate it. She simply received the new position and held it. He settled. Deimos did not move at all. She let the thought of Alexander sit for a moment and then release, the way you let smoke disperse. It had been there. It had meant something. Now the room reclaimed its quiet, and the two boys beside her continued their breathing, their small rhythms, their complete unknowing of the morning moving toward them. This was the other side of what they were, not only the panic moving through an army's legs, not only the hollow dread in a soldier's chest before the trumpet, this too, this room, this stillness. The fact that they came back from every battlefield and slept like this, committed and whole, released into whatever the body knows how to do when there is nothing left to do, she had wondered. Once, whether the work cost them anything, whether fear and dread accumulated somewhere in them, left residue. She understood now that it did not because they were gods and therefore invulnerable, but because their nature was more like weather than like wound. Weather moves through. It does not damage the sky by moving. The twins were not damaged by what they did. They were each time exactly what they had been before. That was its own kind of mercy. For them and, she thought, for the mortals who encountered them, because what mortals needed from fear and dread was not their permanent company. What they needed was the visit, the information. Then the departure, clean. Alexander had understood that. He had let Deimos do his work and then walked into the day. The window held its pale rectangle of growing light. She looked at Deimos's face in it. The way the light was touching him now was different from an hour ago. Warmer. The skin of his cheek no longer colourless, but beginning to carry the first suggestion of warmth, the body's own warmth confirmed by the light rather than obscured by darkness. He looked, she thought again, like a boy who had stopped watching. And beside her Phobos breathed, and the vessel turned, slow and steady, beneath them all. and the darkness outside the window continued its gradual, unhurried retreat from what the morning would require of it. Neither twin woke. She held her position and waited, as she had waited through all the hours before, for nothing in particular. For the next thing, for whatever the morning would bring to this stone room, to these two faces, to the single arc they made between them. The morning was moving now, not arriving. Not complete, but moving the way water moves when there is no wind to show it, just the bare fact of motion. Present, if she knew what to look for. She knew what to look for. The light on the far wall had changed again. The pale rectangle was wider than it had been. The hollow places in the stone were receiving it differently, each small depression casting a faint shadow inward, the rock showing its own texture the way faces show age in certain lights. Factual. Unsentimental. Simply there. Phobos breathed. In. Out. A breath deeper than a sleeping mortal's, slower. The breath of something that did not need to monitor itself. Deimos breathed beside him, thinner, quieter. The offset between them was the same as it had been for hours, two rhythms, one slightly behind the other. If you listened past one, you found the other waiting. She had been thinking about the camp, not any particular camp, all of them. Every Greek camp she had ever felt the twins moving through, every wide plain of sleeping men in the hours before the trumpet. She had been in the quiet of this room long enough that her mind moved outward, the way it did when the body was still, moving to where Phobos had been, where he had worked, tracing the shape of it. A Greek camp before battle was never fully asleep. That was the truth no general told his men, though they all knew it. The fires went low. The sentries paced. But in the tents, beneath oiled cloaks and rough wool, men lay in the particular dark of eyes that would not stay closed. Phobos moved through it. Not as a figure, not as a sound. As a shift in the air beneath the fabric, as the cold that reached a man's hands when no cold had come from outside, as the image that arrived behind the eyes when no dream had been invited. A man in such a camp would feel his heart beating when an hour before he had not felt it at all. He would hear the breath of the man beside him and calculate, without meaning to, how many men were near and how many was not enough. This was Phobos working. She understood it, the way she understood the nature of any force that came from her, not with approval, not with apology, with recognition. He did not choose where he moved. He did not select the man in the farthest tent whose hands had begun to shake. He simply spread the way cold spreads, finding whatever was available to receive him, and in every man who received him something woke that the body had been holding. Not placed there by Phobos, already there. He was not the cause, he was the opening. Deimos was different. She had come to this understanding slowly, over years that no mortal would have had patience to spend. The dread that Deimos carried was not the same as Phobos's panic. It did not arrive suddenly in the cold hands. It lived in the hours before, the days before, in the walk toward the plain before the plain was visible, in the sound of another army's drums heard at a distance when nothing was yet happening and everything was about to. Deimos was the weight of what was coming, the body's knowledge that things were about to change in ways the mind had not yet accepted. He lived in anticipation, in the space between knowing and arriving. A man could manage Phobos by surviving him. The rout happened, or it did not. The panic rose, and then, if the man held, fell back. There was a before and after to Phobos. There was no after with Deimos, not until the thing had happened. Until the battle was joined and the anticipation resolved itself into something real, which was always less terrible than what Deimos had offered. Reality was always bounded. Deimos was not bounded. He was the feeling's full horizon. She looked at him now, his face in the morning light. Still, he looked, in this light, like he was made of patience. Not waiting, not expectant. Simply present and entirely at rest in it, This was what the mortals who prayed to them could not fully hold. That these faces, this sleeping boy's jaw, this small rise and fall of the chest, were the same as what moved through the night before battle. That the god who settled dread into a man's bones at the edge of sleep was this same still shape, breathing quietly, tipping toward the morning with no particular urgency. She did not think this should comfort anyone. She only thought it was true. Phobos moved, not waking. His weight against her arm shifted slightly, redistributed. He breathed out a longer breath. Then his rhythm returned, steady, reliable as the vessel's own movement beneath them. The vessel had turned again. She could feel it in the quality of the light. The rectangle on the far wall had shifted its angle, narrowed slightly on the left side, widened on the right, the morning moving around them, or they around the morning. Hard to say, both perhaps. In every camp she had ever felt them moving through, there had been one man who did not fight what was happening, who lay with his hands open, who let the fear or the dread do what it came to do and did not press it back down. Not many. Usually one. That man was not braver than the others. She had observed this carefully. He was not less afraid. What he had was the particular willingness to be in the body that fear was in, without building distance from it, without telling himself a story about it. The others spent the night in argument. That argument took something from them. By morning they were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The one man who lay with his hands open arrived at morning with more than he had started with. Not peace, not certainty. Something closer to steadiness. The kind that was not built on the absence of knowing what was coming, but on having held it already in the dark. Phobos and Deimos gave that too. Not only the disruption, also this. Deimos did not move. The thin line of his breathing continued. Outside the window the sky was committed now to its change. Not yet gold. Not blue. The particular tone that had no name because it only existed for a short time and mortals were usually not watching. She was watching. She watched it because the twins were asleep and there was nothing else required of her and the colour would not last. The hollow places in the far wall received the light. The crack that ran upward from the floor continued its silent record of years. The two rhythms of breathing continued, offset, steady. Phobos breathed in. Deimos breathed out. And the morning accumulated around them. One small change at a time, indifferent to whether anyone was present to observe it, but observed nonetheless. The thought arrived without announcement. It had no particular weight to it. Just a memory, surfacing the way memories do on moving water, without invitation, without urgency. She remembered the plain. Not the plain as it was before the fighting, the plain as it was after Diomedes had done what he had done, with Athena standing at his shoulder guiding his hand. The grey-eyed goddess who had made herself useful that day in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Ares had gone down. She had not been on the plain when it happened. She had felt it from a distance, the way you feel, a change in pressure before a storm makes itself visible. A shift in the quality of the air. Then the cry. The cry of Ares when the spear took him was not like other sounds. Homer would later write that it carried as far as 9,000 men shouting, or 10,000, depending on which account one read. Neither number was wrong. Neither number was right. Numbers failed it. The sound did not travel through distance. It arrived everywhere at once, the way certain truths do, and then it was gone, and the silence after it was very loud. Phobos had felt it in his sleep that night. She remembered that. He had made a sound of his own, involuntary, brief. A small exhale that was not breathing. Then his breathing had resumed, and whatever had passed through him had settled back, and he had slept. She had not slept. She had sat with what she knew. Ares on the Trojan plain. Ares going down on his knee, the huge dark shape of him folding in a way it was not meant to fold. Diomedes had not done this alone. Athena had placed herself behind the mortal's arm, turned the spear toward what it needed to find. Without her, it would not have been possible. With her it was. That was the thing about gods. You could only be brought down by what you were not expecting, by what came dressed as something ordinary. Diomedes had been ordinary enough. A man with a spear. A man with a good arm and a particular mourning behind him, and a grey-eyed goddess whose patience with Ares had run out in a way she had chosen to make known. The cry had shaken the plain. It had shaken the soldiers in ways they could not name. Phobos had been among them already, or not among them, or moving as he moved, and when Ares went down, something changed in how fear travelled through the army. It did not stop. It accelerated. The sound of a god falling was its own kind of dread, a dread that Deimos would have understood better than anyone. Though he had been quiet after, the way Deimos was when something confirmed what he had already known was coming. She looked at the far wall now. The rectangle of light had moved again, smaller on one side, longer on the other. Ares on the plain. She had this picture complete in her mind and could not release it. The way he had gone down, the dark of him against the pale Trojan dust. He had not been silent when it happened. He was never silent. His voice was part of what he was. The cry, and then the earth receiving some portion of his weight, and the horses pulling without him, and the dust settling in the places where the dust was allowed to settle. The twins had gone to him. That was the part she returned to now. Not the falling, the afterward. They had been moving through the plain already, each in their own way. Phobos spreading through the roots, Deimos sitting in the long pre-battle hours, in the spaces between one man's breath and the next. And then their father's cry reached them both at once, and they had moved toward it without deliberation. She knew this because she had asked them. Afterward, how they had known to go. Phobos had not had an answer. He had looked at her with the particular expression he wore when a question assumed he had made a decision. He had not made a decision. He had simply moved toward it, the way fear moves toward what opens for it. Deimos had said something different. He had said he had felt the cry before it came, that the anticipation of it had been with him for hours. Not a premonition, just the weight. The weight of what was coming, which he always carried, had that day been heavier on one side, and he had learned to trust that asymmetry. They had reached Ares together near the same moment, from different directions. That was how she imagined it. Phobos from within the Greek ranks, moving outward. Deimos from the perimeter, where the not yet happened lived. Both arriving where their father had gone down, both finding him already lifting himself, already shouting toward Olympus, already furious in the way that pain sharpened his fury rather than softening it. They had not embraced him. Ares did not invite that. They had stood near. They had made themselves present. That was what they had to offer, and it was not nothing. Phobos. Deimos, standing in the Trojan dust beside their father while the plain continued its work around them. She had not been there. She was reconstructing it from what she knew of all three of them. From Phobos's weight against her arm now, from Deimos's thin breath, from the plain itself, which she had walked in other hours and knew the quality of, the light on the far wall shifted again. A small movement. Ares had come off the plain that day in the way that a war god comes off a plain after being brought down by a mortal and a grey-eyed goddess. Which is to say, loudly, and with a great deal of intention. He had gone to Zeus. He had made his case with the volume he always brought to his cases. Zeus had received him with the weary patience of a father who has heard this particular complaint before and who will hear it again. The twins had not followed him all the way to Olympus that day. They had stopped at the threshold. She knew this without having been told. It was simply true, the way certain things about the twins were simply true. They were attendants. They stood near. They did not enter where they were not part of the proceeding. They had waited at the threshold while Ares was received. and then they had returned to the plain, because the plain was still there. Because dread and fear do not lift when a god is wounded, they settle deeper. The soldiers had felt Ares fall, his cry had moved through them. And in the wake of it, they were more open to what the twins carried, not less. Phobos breathed in. A longer breath than the others, Deimos breathed out. Slightly behind, outside, the unnamed colour continued. Not yet resolved into gold, not retreating back into the unnameable dark before it. Still that particular shade that had no anchor, no before or after in the language of colour. She watched it. The hollow places in the wall received what light there was. The crack continued its upward line, patient, indifferent to what moved beside it. The vessel turned. She felt it in her spine before the light confirmed it. The gold had arrived. Not fully, not with any declaration, just the first thin warmth of it moving along the horizon line, finding the upper edge of the crack in the wall. Resting there without weight. Ennio watched it without moving. The twins were as they had been, Phobos with his slight pause after each breath, Deimos already reaching toward the next one before the current had finished. The vessel held its position on the water, settled now, no longer turning. The morning had made its decision. She had waited for it. Not impatiently. There was nothing in her that required impatience any more. She had learned, in whatever the long arrangement of her existence was, that mornings came at the pace they came, and the waiting was simply part of what the dark was for. Outside, the gold continued its slow claim. The unnamed colour did not disappear. It was absorbed. It became part of what the morning carried, the way one thing often becomes part of another without either ceasing to be itself. She thought of the threshold, the twins standing there. Olympus rising above them, its particular light which was not the same as daylight, not the same as any light that fell on plains or cities or water. The light of Olympus had always been its own category. She had been near enough to see it from a distance, not near enough to enter. The twins had not tried to enter. They had stood at the edge of what they were permitted to stand at, and they had waited, and their father's voice had come through the walls of wherever Zeus receives complaints, and they had listened to it diminish as Ares made his case, and Zeus absorbed it with whatever patience Zeus maintained for his most difficult son. And then Ares had come back through, and his voice had been somewhat less than it was when he went in, not diminished exactly, but settled, the way a fire settles when the largest piece of wood finally catches and the flame finds its own level. He had not looked at the twins directly when he came back through. Ares rarely did. He had moved past them, and they had followed, and the three of them had gone back toward the plain without speaking, because there was nothing to say that the plain would not say more clearly once they were on it again. The vessel shifted on the water, just slightly. A rocking so small it would not have been visible to anyone who was not already still enough to feel it. Phobos breathed in. The pause, then out. Deimos exhaled ahead of his inhale as Deimos did. The gold moved another degree along the wall. She had not thought, until this morning, how the threshold moment held something specific about the twins that the plane could not. On the plane they were functions. They spread through armies the way a temperature change spreads through water, without decision, without effort. The spreading was simply what happened when they moved. At the threshold of Olympus they had been something else. They had been suns, not in the way Ares invited, not in any way that required acknowledgement from him or from Zeus within, just in the plain fact of their standing there, outside, waiting for their father to come back through. The way certain things that do not announce themselves are still undeniably what they are. She had been a keeper of many things. She kept the record of what the twins witnessed. She had not understood until now that she also kept this. The image of them at the threshold, the way they had stood. Not the way attendants stand, not positioned for function, closer together than they usually allowed themselves. Deimos slightly forward, Phobos with his shoulder turned toward the door. Two young gods at the edge of their father's hearing. It was not dread that they had carried in that moment, and it was not fear. It was the thing that lives underneath both, the thing that dread and fear are built from. That does not have its own name, because it is too close to the source to be looked at directly. She had not named it then. She did not name it now. The gold moved across the wall at its own rate. The crack held the light along its upper edge, a thin bright line against the clay colour. Phobos made a small sound. Not a word, not quite a breath. A sound that sleep sometimes produces when something shifts in the body without waking it. He did not stir. Deimos exhaled. Outside, a bird called from somewhere on the water. One call, then nothing. The silence after it was different from the silence before. Enyo had been keeper of many records. She had held the long account of the Trojan plain, the weight of Diomedes' arm, the quality of Athena's guidance from behind a mortal shoulder. She had held Phobos on the roots, Deimos at the perimeter, the particular asymmetry of the morning. Deimos had known what was coming before it came. She held the threshold. Two shapes in the light that was not daylight, standing outside a door they did not open, waiting for a father who did not invite tenderness, and who received it anyway, in the only form they knew how to offer. Their presence, their stillness, the fact of them being there when the door came open again. The morning continued its arrival. The vessel did not turn. The gold came along the bottom of the wall now, not just the crack, spreading across the clay colour in a low wash that was warm without being urgent. She looked at Phobos. His face in the new light was quieter than it ever was on the plain. The plain arranged him differently. Here, beside her, in the vessel, in the early warmth of a morning that had finally committed to itself, he was simply a sleeping face. Young in the way that certain things are young, regardless of how long they have existed. Deimos, at her other side, was not sleeping. He was at his threshold, the thin line he inhabited between what was coming and what was still here. His eyes were not open, but his breathing said he was there. Somewhere in the narrow space between one state and the next. She did not speak to him. He did not need her to. This was the arrangement of the three of them in the quiet hours. Her watching, Phobos resting, Deimos at his particular edge, the plain somewhere outside, and Ares somewhere further out than that, already finding the next place where his presence was required. Already moving toward whatever morning the gods of war move toward when the night has finished its particular work. The gold finished its claim on the wall. The crack held it cleanly now, the line of it bright against the clay, not dramatic, not a transformation, just the morning having settled into what morning becomes when no one is measuring its approach. The bird on the water called once more. Phobos breathed. The pause, then out, and his shoulders settled a degree lower against her arm, the way shoulders settle when the body has released something it was holding without knowing it was held. She let her own breath out. The vessel rested on the water, still at last, not turning, not rocking. Simply there in the new light with all three of them inside it, and the morning fully arrived, and the plain outside beginning its day in the way that plains begin days. Without fanfare, without announcement, 1 degree of warmth at a time until the pale dust caught the gold, and the walls of the distant city went from dark stone to lit stone, and the torches on the ramparts, the few that had lasted through the night, were no longer visible against what the sky had become. Enyo held the stillness the way the vessel held the water, without effort, without choosing to. The city walls caught the new light and held it. From here they were distant enough to be shapes rather than structures, stone going pale. Towers losing their darkness, one facing at a time. She had looked at those walls for many mornings. She knew what they held behind them. She knew what they would hold when all of this was finished. The knowledge sat in her the way all long knowledge sits, quietly. taking up space without announcing itself. Phobos shifted against her arm. Not a waking movement, something smaller than that. A settling, the way sediment settles in water that has stopped being disturbed. His breathing continued its pattern. The long pull-in, the pause that was its own duration. The slow release. She did not watch him closely. She did not need to. Deimos remained where he was, neither here nor there, his breath moving at its own forward lean. Always a fraction ahead of the moment, as though his body had learned to reach toward what was coming before it arrived. It had served him on the plane. In the vessel, in the quiet, it simply was what it was, his particular nature. The way certain rivers run faster than the ground suggests they should. She thought about what they were when no battle was asking it of them. Not a new thought, but the morning had a quality that made old thoughts feel unhurried. What Phobos was, in those hours, was simple enough. He was the sleeping face in new light. A shoulder that had released what it was holding, a breath that moved at the pace of something genuinely at rest. The plane had a use for the other Phobos, the one that emptied armies of their steadiness. The one whose face had been hammered into Agamemnon's bronze because a king had understood that fear projected outward was fear controlled, but Agamemnon's shield was somewhere on the plane. And in the vessel there was only this, a young god resting in the warmth of a morning that had finally arrived. Deimos was harder to read in stillness. He was always harder to read. His nature was the approach of things, the moment before the moment. On the plain he had walked the far perimeter, beyond where the torchlight reached, in the space where men's bodies were still lying in their tents, but their minds were already moving toward what dawn would ask of them. He had not needed to do anything there. His presence was the work. Dread does not require speech or gesture. It requires only arrival. Here in the vessel he was not doing that work, but he had not set it down either. It was simply held differently. Like a tool, a craftsman keeps near even when the task is finished. She let her eyes move back to the crack in the wall. The light inside it had spread from the upper edge down now. The whole length of it was bright, not a line anymore, but a narrow column, the gold dispersed into something less focused, less precise. Morning having diffused itself through its own warmth, she thought about what Ares' children were when they were not beside him. The thought had a shape she recognized. She had turned it in different ways over the course of many years on the plain, and in the years before the plain, and in the hours on the water where there was nothing to do but watch the light move. The twins were attendants in the fullest sense. They did not exist apart from their function the way Harmonia existed apart from hers. Harmonia had been given to Cadmus. She had walked into a human life and stayed there. She had become something that did not require the retinue. Phobos and Deimos had not been given anywhere. They circled. That was the word she found for it now, in the quiet. With the gold spreading through the crack, and the city walls pale in the distance, and Phobos breathing beside her in his slow rhythm. They circled. Not the plain specifically, not Olympus. Not any particular city or campaign or century of conflict. They circled Ares. The way attendants do, the way smaller bodies move around the larger one, held by proximity, held by something that is not quite choice and not quite compulsion. Something that lives underneath both of those things and does not have its own name, because names are for things you can step back from far enough to see clearly. She had known this about them before. She had known it as a thought. She knew it fully now. Phobos inhaled. The pause. The exhale, and his lips parted slightly, and the vessel carried the sound of his breath out into the still air, and it dissolved there, absorbed by the warmth, gone. Deimos's breathing reached forward. Outside, no bird called. The water did not move against the hull. The pale dust of the plain was still. The city's walls held their new brightness without shifting. Enyo kept the record of all of it. The morning, the two of them. The gold that had finished arriving and was simply present now, no longer moving, just there along the lower wall in its warm, undramatic fact. She did not know what Ares was doing at this hour. She rarely knew. He was somewhere that required him. He moved toward those places without rest, without the breathing patterns his sons had developed in the long hours away from the work. That was his nature, and his sons who circled him had inherited the moving. Just at a different distance, Phobos did not know this about himself yet. Deimos might have known it. He was the one who sensed the approach of things. Perhaps he had already felt the shape of his own life from far enough away to recognize it. Perhaps that was what he sat with, at his edge between sleeping and waking, in the thin line he inhabited where most things could not follow. She did not ask him. She watched the wall. She watched Phobos. She watched the light hold still for once, having gone as far as it was going. The vessel rested on the water. The morning sat above the plain without comment, without urgency, neither asking anything of the city walls, nor of the pale dust below them, nor of the three inside the hull who had, between them, witnessed more than they would ever be asked to account for. Phobos breathed. Deimos reached forward in his breath, ever so slightly, toward the next moment. And Enyo held what she had always held, the record, and the stillness at the center of it, and the two of them orbiting in the quiet, as they had since the beginning, as they would until Ares moved again, and the plane called back what the plane required. The names had been given at the beginning. Ares had spoken them before the twins had opened their eyes. Before they had drawn their first breath, before Aphrodite had settled them against her, before Olympus had registered their weight in the world, the names came first. Phobos, Deimos. Fear and dread, named into existence before existence had fully arrived. That was how it worked with Ares. He did not wait to see what a thing became. He named it for what it was already going to be. Enyo thought about this now. Not for the first time. The light along the lower wall had gone still and gold and warm. Outside, the city walls held their pale stone against the morning. Nothing moved. She thought about the names the way she had thought about them across many years and many planes, not with urgency, with the quiet attention she gave to things that did not require resolution, only observation. Phobos had been named on Agamemnon's shield, not in word, but in image, his face hammered into bronze at the center of the great king's armor. The face she knew now, slack with sleep, pressed against her arm, that face had been replicated in metal and worn into battle by a man who believed that carrying the image of fear would protect him from it. Mortals did that. They placed the thing they feared at the center of what guarded them. It was not foolishness exactly. It was a kind of logic that Enyo had come to understand over centuries of watching how humans constructed their courage. You named the terror, you put it on the outside. You walked toward the thing that made your hands cold. Phobos inhaled. The pause, the exhale. Agamemnon had gone down into the dust like every other man. The shield had gone somewhere that shields go. The image of Phobos hammered into its center had not kept the king alive, but it had been a true name. Whatever else could be said about the shield and the man who carried it, the face on the bronze had been correctly identified. Fear was what it was. It did not require softening to be honored. Alexander had understood this differently. He had not put the twins on a shield. He had offered smoke and grain at the altar before Gaugamela, and the offerings had not been a request to remove fear from the field. They had been an acknowledgement. He was about to walk toward something vast, and the right posture toward vastness was not denial. He had sacrificed to the twins the way a careful man acknowledges weather before setting out across open ground, not to stop the rain. To mark that he had seen the sky and understood its color. The empire had opened before him afterward. Whether the twins had anything to do with it was a question Enyo did not answer. She kept records. She did not adjudicate causation. Deimos's breath moved forward in the stillness. The city walls outside the hull showed no movement, no torches now. The morning had replaced them, clean and unlit, the stone holding the sun's early warmth without effort. Phobos had been named on the shield of Heracles too. The great hero who had faced 12 labours, who had moved through the world breaking the things that needed breaking, had gone to war with fear depicted alongside him in bronze and silver. 2 heroes. 2 different generations. 2 shields. The same face at the centre of both. Deimos watched the approach of things. He had been watching it since before the first campaign. He was watching it now in the vessel, in the quiet, in the half-sleep he maintained at the edge of waking. The next moment was always arriving for him before it arrived for anyone else. That was his nature. Not the rout, not the breaking. That was his brother's work, the panic that moved through an army like a sound through water. Deimos was what came before. The weight in the chest before the trumpet. The cold at the base of the neck in the hour before the line broke. Both of them had been named for what they were, not what they chose. Enyo held this thought without pressing on it. Outside. A thin thread of water ran along the hull's edge. Not movement exactly, just the settling of the vessel by a fraction on the still surface. A sound so slight she registered it only because everything else was quieter. They had been named in the sky too. This she had not been present for. No one from the retinue had been there, she thought, in the way that anyone was present for anything in those cold distances. 2 moons circling the red planet, circling the orbit of the god who bore the same name as their father, circling and circling in the dark, without arrival, without departure. Named by a mortal who had looked through a long glass at the sky and found them there and reached back into the old stories for what to call them. Phobos. Deimos. The same names Ares had spoken before they opened their eyes. The mortal had found the twins already circling and named them correctly without knowing he had done it. That was the thing about a true name. You could arrive at it from any direction. You could come to it from ancient poetry or from a glass pointed at the stars. It met you where you were. Phobos exhaled. His lips parted slightly. The sound of the exhale was soft, absorbed by the warm air inside the hull. His weight against Enyo's arm was unchanged. Deimos remained where he was, still and forward, tilting in his stillness, his breath already at the next moment's door. The gold along the lower wall did not shift. The morning had finished its arriving. What remained was simply light, present and unhurried, having no further business with the crack it had entered through. Enyo let her eyes rest on the wall for a while, then on Phobos, then on the pale distance of the city walls through the hull's open edge. The twins had been named at the beginning. Hammered into shields, offered smoke and grain on the night before a great battle, found circling in the dark above the orbit of the war god's domain. All those namings were the same naming. The one Ares had spoken first, before the twins drew breath. Fear and dread. Phobos and Deimos. The names had not changed because the things they named had not changed. They were what they were before they were born, and they were still that now, here, asleep and half asleep in the still morning on the quiet water. Phobos breathed. Deimos leaned forward into the next moment. Enyo kept the record. The vessel rested without movement on the flat surface of the water. The city walls stood in their pale morning stone. The plain beyond them held its dust without disturbance, without wind, without the sound of anything preparing to begin. The dust on the plain had no intention of moving. Enyo had watched it long enough to know. There was no tremor beneath the ground, no approaching column, no horse raising its head at a distant sound. The plain was as it had been since the dark had lifted from it, still and pale and holding nothing. She had been in many places where stillness was temporary, Where the quiet before dawn was not rest but preparation, the landscape gathering itself for what came next, this was not that. This stillness had the quality of something that had finished its work and set it down. She did not disturb it. Phobos was still pressed against her arm. His breath came in long intervals now, slower than before, the rhythm of deep sleep rather than the lighter suspension he had kept earlier in the dark. His face was slack, not peaceful in the way that word was usually meant, the way Aphrodite might have called it peaceful, with something gentle in it. More neutral than that, his face at rest was simply a face from which everything active had withdrawn. Fear, when it slept, looked like nothing at all. Deimos had not moved either, but his not. Moving was different. His was the stillness of held attention. He sat as he had sat for hours, slightly inclined toward the open edge of the hull, his breath already at the border of the next moment, while his body remained here. The morning had settled completely now. No more arriving. The gold along the lower wall was simply present, not entering. Not spreading, just there in the way that established light simply is. Enya rested her gaze on the near wall of the hull for a while. She thought about what it meant to carry a name, as long as these two had carried theirs, Phobos and Deimos. Not names given the way a mother names a child for a hope or a quality she wishes them toward, names given for what was already true. Ares had not named them and made them what they were. He had named them because they were already that, already fully themselves in the moment before they opened their eyes. A small insect moved across the interior floor of the hull, following some intention of its own along the grain of the wood. Enya watched it cross from shadow into the line of morning light and continue without slowing. The shields had only confirmed what was already true. When the craftsmen had pressed Phobos's face into the metal of Agamemnon's shield, they had not invented him or diminished him. They had recognized him. The image at the center of the great shield was an acknowledgement. Here is the thing I carry with me into the field. Here is what I ask men to reckon with when they look at me coming toward them. Deimos had never been given a shield face. His work happened in the interior of men, in the hours before any shield was raised. He did not need to be depicted. He was already inside the person who was going to see the shield. The insect reached the far wall and disappeared into a thin seam in the wood. Outside, a bird passed across the visible section of sky above the hull's open edge. It was moving without hurry, on a heading that had nothing to do with the city or the plain or the still water beneath the vessel. It crossed and was gone. Phobos exhaled. The sound was barely a sound. A shift of warm air inside the hull, absorbed before it reached the walls. Enya had kept records of a great many battles. The numbers did not interest her. What she noted was the texture of events. The way some battles had the character of something long prepared, and others had the character of something that surprised even the combatants. The Trojan plain had been the former. It had been a war of accumulated weight, pressing down for years until the weight exceeded what could be held and released all at once. The twins had been present for that release. Present for the campaigns that followed in other generations. Present on the night before Gaugamela, when Alexander had knelt at a small altar in the dark and made his acknowledgment of what was coming. They were always present. That was what it meant to be what they were. They did not choose their attendances. Where war was, they were. Where men lay in darkness the night before a charge, Deimos was already there, circling the perimeter of the camp in the cold hours, not entering. Simply being at the edge of perception, which was all his presence required, and afterward, when the lines broke and the rout began, Phobos moved through the field, not as a figure men could point to, as a quality of the air, as the sound of footsteps that were not measured any more, as the knowledge in the legs that the legs had decided before the mind had. He slept now. He slept with his face slack against Enya's arm, and the plain outside held no army. and the still water held the vessel without effort, and the morning continued without urgency toward whatever came after morning. Deimos breathed. His breath moved toward the next moment as it had always moved, tilted forward in its orientation, attending to the approach of things. But the next moment this morning held nothing that required him. He could lean toward it and find only more of this, more stillness, more pale stone, more light sitting calmly on the interior wall of a vessel that had no current carrying it anywhere. Ennio kept the record of this too. Not every entry in the record was a battle. Some were simply this: two gods at rest in the quiet after a long work. The retinue scattered to its own resting places, Eris somewhere with her own council, Ares somewhere above on Olympus. The war horses stabled and standing in their long breathing in the dark of a stall. The insect emerged again from the seam in the wood on the far wall and crossed back through the light toward the shadow from which it had first appeared. Phobos did not stir. Deimos held his patient lean toward the coming moment, finding nothing urgent in it, remaining nevertheless alert. That was the condition of his nature. He could not be otherwise. He simply attended, and this morning what he attended to was the particular silence of a world between one thing and the next. The pale city walls outside caught the morning light along their upper edge where the stone was brightest and held it without effort. The vessel rested on the water. Ennio's hand lay open on her knee, the way a hand lies when it is holding nothing and has no expectation of holding anything. Phobos breathed. If you have found rest in this old story, a quiet like or a subscription carries the work forward, and there will be more waiting for you. The twins slept and watched in the still morning. As they had in the dark of every camp before every battle the world had ever named. Two small moons turning slowly in the warm air above the water, circling without destination, circling without end, while the plain beyond the pale walls held its dust and its silence in the long, unhurried light.